Jim Morrison told the world his parents were dead. When the Doors released their first album in 1967, the liner notes listed Morrison's parents as deceased. They were not dead. They were alive. His father was a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy. Not just any admiral. The admiral who commanded American naval forces during the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, the event that the United States government used to escalate its involvement in the Vietnam War. The father who started the war, the son who wrote The Unknown Soldier. That is one story that got left out. Here is another. When Jim Morrison died in Paris on July 3, 1971, his body stayed in the bathtub for 3 days before anyone called the undertakers. There was no autopsy, ever. The official cause of death was heart failure, but nobody who was there agreed on what actually happened. The most detailed alternative account comes from a nightclub manager who says he found Morrison dead in a toilet stall that night and watched 2 drug dealers carry the body home. This is the story of Jim Morrison that didn't make it into the legend. James Douglas Morrison was born on December 8, 1943 in Melbourne, Florida. His father, George Stephen Morrison, was a career naval officer, ambitious, formal, a man climbing a very specific ladder in a very specific world. Jim spent his childhood moving from base to base, San Diego, Alameda, Alexandria, Jacksonville. Never in one place long enough to put down roots, never stable enough to feel at home anywhere. He was, by every account, an exceptionally intelligent child. His IQ tested at 149, the top 0.1%. He was reading Nietzsche, Rimbaud, William Blake, and Jack Kerouac, while his classmates were reading assigned texts. His relationship with his father was cold and distant. George Morrison was a man of discipline, order, and institutional authority. Jim Morrison was becoming something else entirely. In 1964, George Stephen Morrison was in command of U.S. naval forces aboard the USS Bonhomme Richard in the Gulf of Tonkin. On August 4, 1964, the Johnson administration claimed that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. The incident was used to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, effectively giving President Johnson the authority to escalate military involvement in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. It was later revealed that the second attack, the one that triggered the resolution, almost certainly never happened. George Morrison was there. He commanded the forces involved. His son, Jim, would later write music that became the soundtrack to the anti-war movement his father helped start. Jim Morrison never spoke publicly about his father's role in Vietnam. He didn't need to. The Unknown Soldier said everything. Jim Morrison's father commanded the naval forces at the event that started the Vietnam War. Jim wrote anti-war music. Did you know this connection existed? Jim Morrison enrolled at UCLA's film school in 1964. He was 20 years old. He was already reading everything: Artaud, Baudelaire, Blake, Kerouac, Nietzsche. He was already writing poetry that his professors found unsettling in its intelligence and its darkness. On a Venice Beach rooftop in the summer of 1965, he ran into a former classmate named Ray Manzarek. Manzarek asked what Morrison had been doing. Morrison said he'd been writing songs. Manzarek asked him to sing one. Morrison sang Moonlight Drive. Manzarek said later, "When he sang those first lines to me, I said, that's it. I'd never heard lyrics like that before, and I said, let's start a band and make $1 million. The Doors formed. Robbie Krieger on guitar, John Densmore on drums, Ray Manzarek on keyboards, Jim Morrison as vocalist, though vocalist barely covers what he did. What Morrison did on stage was something else. He was not performing songs. He was performing possession. He was the shaman and the chaos. and the thing that happens when someone has read too much Nietzsche and been kept moving too long. In 1967, their debut album was released. Light My Fire became a top 5 hit. Morrison became famous almost overnight. In the liner notes, his parents were listed as deceased. His mother was alive. His father was a Rear Admiral of the United States Navy. Morrison later said he didn't want the association. He didn't want people knowing he was the son of a military man. He wanted to be the Lizard King. He wanted to be the poet from nowhere, beholden to nothing. His father acknowledged the estrangement. He said he couldn't blame his son for not wanting contact. He never repudiated Jim publicly. They never reconciled. Jim Morrison died before his father did. Morrison told the world his parents were dead so he could reinvent himself completely. Do you think any great artist can tell the whole truth about where they came from? By 1969, Jim Morrison's relationship with the rock star life was falling apart. The drinking had always been there. The drugs had always been there. But something had shifted. The performances were becoming less about music and more about confrontation with the audience, with authority, with the idea of what a rock star was supposed to be. On March 1st, 1969, in Miami, Morrison allegedly exposed himself on stage during a Doors concert. He denied it. Several witnesses denied it. But he was arrested and charged with indecent exposure and profanity. The conviction, which came in 1970, threatened to follow him everywhere. Venues refused to book the Doors. The band's commercial momentum stalled. Morrison said later of the Miami incident, "I think I was just fed up with the image that had been created around me, which I sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, cooperated with. It was just too much for me to stomach, and I put an end to it one glorious, drunken evening." He had also been writing poetry, seriously, obsessively, with the conviction that his real legacy would be literary, not musical. He self-published 2 collections, The Lords and the New Creatures in 1969 and The New Creatures the same year. He distributed them from a bag. Most people didn't know he had written them. He wanted to be a poet. He had been made into a rock god. And the distance between those 2 things was destroying him. Morrison wanted to be remembered as a poet, not a rock star. He self-published collections that almost nobody read. Which do you think he really was? In March 1971, Jim Morrison moved to Paris with his girlfriend Pamela Corson. Paris was supposed to be the escape, the clean break, the place where he could shed the Lizard King and become the poet he had always wanted to be. Friends who saw him in those early months in Paris said he seemed different, calmer, happier. He was writing, he was walking, he looked healthier than he had in years. He visited the graves of poets and writers at Père Lachaise Cemetery, Oscar Wilde, Balzac, Chopin. He walked among the graves of people who had been artists before him and felt, by various accounts, something like peace. He didn't know he would be buried there in less than 4 months. The drinking continued. The drugs continued. Paris was not the salvation he had hoped for. For someone with Morrison's constitution and addictions, no city was a salvation. The escape was always temporary. In late June 1971, Morrison began coughing up blood. He was exhausted. He was ill. On July 2nd, 1971, he went to a movie. He and Pamela listened to records at home. According to Pamela's account, they went to sleep. Morrison woke up in the night feeling ill. He took a hot bath. Pamela found him there, dead, at approximately 6 a.m. on July 3rd, 1971. He was 27 years old. Morrison went to Paris to become a poet and escape the rock star. Do you think he was running towards something or away from it? The official story ends there. Heart failure in a bathtub, 27 years old, Père Lachaise Cemetery. But the official story has problems. No autopsy was ever conducted. The French authorities accepted Pamela Courson's account and closed the case as heart failure within days. The Doors manager was told Morrison was fine, in hospital recovering, before Courson eventually admitted he was dead. Morrison's body was reportedly left in the bathtub for 3 days, wrapped in plastic and packed in ice, before the undertakers finally delivered his coffin. Pamela Courson gave contradictory accounts of what happened. The Doors' second manager later said she told him multiple conflicting versions, sometimes blaming herself, sometimes saying she had killed Jim. Jim's close friend Alain Ronay, who arrived at the apartment shortly after, later confessed that he had helped Courson cover up the circumstances of Morrison's death, corroborating her story that Morrison had never taken drugs that night, when he believed that wasn't true. And then there is Sam Burnett. Burnett was the manager of a Paris nightclub called Rock and Roll Circus, one of the places Morrison frequented in his final weeks. In a book published in 2007, Burnett claimed that Morrison had come to the club on the night of July 2nd, that he had scored heroin in a toilet stall, that Burnett had found him dead, slumped over the toilet, foam coming from his lips. Burnett says drug dealers insisted Morrison was merely unconscious and carried him out of the club to a waiting car. He says the club owner told him to keep quiet. He kept quiet for 36 years. If Burnett's account is true, Morrison did not die in the bathtub. He died in a nightclub toilet. The body was brought home. Someone put him in the bath. Pamela Courson died on April 25, 1974, heroin overdose. She was 27 years old. She never gave a final account. Whatever she knew, she took with her. The bathtub, the toilet stall, the 3 days in ice, the no autopsy. 50 years later, we still don't know exactly what happened on the night Jim Morrison died. Subscribe. There are more stories like this one. Every week, every one of them is real, or as real as the evidence allows.